right, welcome to another Storyworks Roundtable. Today, we are talking about active protagonists. If your protagonist is active, he has got to have agency. That means he is making choices, taking action, and then dealing with the consequences of those actions every step along the way throughout your story, right up through the big climax. All right, Matt and Kathryn, first thoughts?
Okay. I have a tendency to let my protagonists have other people help them too much in climax scenes. I'm always like, oh, there's this side character. He's going to be the one that throws her the gun, or he's going to be the one that... But that's never a good idea because it takes agency away from the protagonist. So it's something I always have to check for. Is she making an active choice here? Is she making an active choice here? And she has to make a choice moving into each stage of the story, especially in the climax.
Absolutely. And, you might think that that choice is phone a friend. That's the wrong choice, right? Pick the choice that raises the stakes and the tension to a new level for each chapter, for each progression toward that climax. And if you have to get the supporting characters out of the way, in Dark Corners in Skog Hall, I sent Jess's boyfriend Beckett to Duluth. And I set it up. It was mentioned several times throughout the book. Beckett has a show. He's an artist. He's going to Duluth. Well, guess when the climax went down?
Right.
When Beckett's in Duluth, right? Because Jess needs agency.
I had to do this just the other day. I find that the best way for me to discover whether or not my protagonist is active enough is if I start telling someone what my story is about, like scene by scene. And if I start everything with this happens too, this happens to, or then this happens, rather than saying, she does this or she does that or she makes this happen, then I'm missing something big because everything's happening to my character instead of my character happening to everything else. So if I'm summarizing things and I'm using verbs that show that my character is being reactionary rather than creating the conflict or moving into the conflict, then I know that I have to fix that scene or maybe other scenes around it. To make her more active.
Yes.
So you're using the language as a cue to signal the passive. That's really interesting.
Yep. That's a really good point. So your character has to go to the store, not milk came home.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the subject should be your character. The verb should be something your character actively does, an action verb. And that will cue you linguistically that you've got an active protagonist.
Right.
And if the subject is other characters, or you're saying this happened, right? Making the protagonist the object of the sentence, then you're missing it. Yeah, exactly. It's a great point, Kathryn.
Well, that's not to say that coincidences can't happen in a story, right?
They do
that's
all the time.
It doesn't have to be every
crucial
event.
Moments, right?
Exactly.
So as long as it doesn't happen in the event that kicks your character into the third act, right? That has to be a choice that they make.
Other than the inciting incident, your character should always be in charge of escalation. So things happen, those are the consequences. So my character makes a choice to engage. As a result of that engagement, the situation escalates, right? That's the stuff that's happening. But then the character has to make a new choice to deal with that stuff that's happening. And that new choice has consequences that, again, escalate the action. So it's not that bad guys don't do things and coincidences don't happen and people don't come and go. All that stuff has to happen as well. But your character has to respond with a choice that escalates things toward the climax.
And I hear people talk a lot about the try-fail cycles, or the things where your character does something and it fails and things get worse. They have to do something and fail and make things worse. Stuff can't just happen to them to make things worse, which is what my default always is. It's oh, and then this happened and things got worse. I'm like, no, it can't just happen to make things worse. Like you say, up the stakes. It's that they have to have tried something or moved forward or made a decision or done something in the story in order to have that negative consequence that moves forward.
Yeah.
You can't just a random natural disaster that moves the story forward unless they created the natural disaster somehow. Like, you have to have that constant them trying something, them making a decision.
The natural disaster could happen, but it's the choice that they make while it's happening that affects the story and moves it forward.
Right.
I keep thinking of
it
Wile E. Coyote.
Wile E. Coyote.
Well, I just keep thinking of Wile E. Coyote. Like, he never gets a piano dropped on him unless it's his own fault, you know?
Right. He rigs it in the first place.
Exactly. He's the one who ordered the thing from Acme that blew up in his face.
Yes.
It's his pursuit of the Roadrunner that gets him injured. Right? If he wasn't chasing the Roadrunner, he wouldn't get hurt. So it was all his own fault. You know, he owns his agency in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Even though,
yeah. So I don't really love the try-fail cycle thing. I don't think your protagonist has to try something and fail and try something and fail and try something and fail and then have a climax. That's not what story is to me. You could try something and succeed, like winning the battle but not the war, and that can escalate things. That can up the stakes with the antagonist. That, you know, so there are lots of other ways to move your protagonist through a story.
Right. There's the other one was the yes, but, and no and, or something like that, you know, where your character gets something and then, but then this other thing happens, or no, they don't get it and something else happens, kind of a thing.
Right.
All things I've heard.
I like to think of it in terms of out of the fry pan and into the fire. So if my, let's say my character's chain falls off her bike and it's dusk and she's riding alone and it gets like tangled up in the gears and she can't turn her pedals so the wheel won't turn, so she can't ride her bike. And the trail is empty because it's dark now. What is she going to do? Well, and if I go, well, what would I do? Okay, I would pull out my cell phone. Well, fry pan, fire, her battery's dead, right? Okay, so what next? I would wait for someone to come along. Well, that's passive, and you kind of know on the trail the kind of people who are going to come along, so that doesn't really up the tension. So what if she drags her bike with the wheel that won't turn onto the city streets, away from the safety of the trails, and she ends up in kind of a questionable neighborhood after dark, and she's alone and she doesn't have a cell phone. Now the stakes are higher. The tension is higher. She made a choice. She moved. There will be consequences.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you use that example because she's still reacting, right? She's reacting to the situation, but that doesn't mean that she's passive because she's still making choices. You can react and still be an active character.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think of, and it's totally splitting hairs, but sometimes you need to do that to help you structure your story. I like to think of reactions as like knee-jerk reactions, gut reactions, things that we don't necessarily control, whereas responses are when you're making that choice, when you're thinking it through, and there's some premeditation, right? So, yeah, but whenever you try to keep your protagonist active, keep asking yourself, get away from what would I do? What's the logical thing a sane person would do in this situation? And think, what can my character do that will make it worse, that will up the stakes and the tension? And give her a choice. Pick the choice that's the toughest.
Yeah, it's all about making choices. I think that, so there's like 3-act structure. The beginning of Act 2, I feel like a lot of people, myself included, fall into that reactive cycle where they're like, oh, the inciting incident just happened, right? So I'm going to let my character get dragged along for a while, right? But then you remove all their agency because you want them to fall into worse and worse situations. And it's just like that point in particular in a story, I feel like is really susceptible to falling into the passive protagonist role. And if you do that, the reader will notice and they'll be like, well, that's not really believable. That's not logical. She didn't make a choice there, and they'll lose interest. And I think a lot of writers do that. They'll have this awesome opening, great hook, kick-ass, inciting incident, and then once they get through the first plot point, they start letting the character just mosey along. Oh, let me meet the wizard. Let me meet, just like fall into this whole thing. But if they lose their agency, you'll lose your reader.
Right. Well, and it's important for people to remember that the inciting incident is a brief moment in the story. It is not a big drawn-out thing. So if you look at Star Wars, the inciting incident is when Luke gets home to the farm and it's torched and his aunt and uncle are dead. That's it. That one moment. His whole world has just been turned upside down. He did nothing to bring it on himself. He's now faced with this choice. He could join the army. He could go live with some friends. He could rebuild the farm. He could, become a merchant marine. Like whatever he could do as a young man with no ties in this world. His choice now that launches the rest of the story is to go back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and become an apprentice. But the inciting incident is just that moment of my ties to family and responsibility have been wiped away. Right? So obviously, if he had chosen anything other than going back to Obi-Wan Kenobi, we wouldn't have Star Wars. It wouldn't exist. But the point is, Luke had choices, and he made a choice. That was an active protagonist moment, right? It launched the hero's journey.
Yeah, and Luke can be kind of whiny, but he always makes choices.
Yep.
Yeah. That's why he gets his hand cut off.
Go Luke.
Because he made a choice to face his father and yada, yada, yada.
Yep. Yada, yada, yada.
I guess you could always think to yourself in the climax, like, did my character lose a hand? And if not, he's probably not an active protagonist.
Right. What? Did my character lose a hand?
Was there consequences for what their choices were?
Right. Consequences. That's my point. Okay. You don't need the hand anymore.
Right.
In Star Wars, metaphorical hand.
Yes, that was a metaphorical hand. Did my character lose a hand? Okay, it better be yes.
They get through it, and they're not scratched. They're not like there's no consequence for their choices, because there's always consequences for choices.
Right.
So if they're making a choice, there's going to be some consequence, right? Whether it's good or bad.
Right. Very true.
Scales.
Yep. Very true. So, other thoughts about active protagonists? Keeping your protagonist active.
Oh, man. It's one of those things where you kind of have to, well, at least for me, I have to plan it. So I have to do it in my outlining stage, or else I have to go through and scrap whole entire sections and rewrite them, which is where I'm at right now. I'm like rewriting the entire second portion of like 3 or 4 scenes in there, because I had to let's make some choices here. But like really taking the time to plan it and doing that sort of thing where you do make your character the subject and give them an action and a choice is really important, so that you're writing something from the beginning.
Right. Yes.
So. Just why Discovery writers kind of have it hard, right? Because if you discover, stumble your way into the story, and then you look back and you're like, wow, none of those scenes were my protagonist wasn't active in any of those scenes. Now I have to go back and rewrite them, which is kind of a bummer. So if you can plot your way to active choices, then I guess that makes your life easier.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So don't be a pantser. That's our final word on active protagonists.
Or if you are doing that, then you need to make sure that your protagonist is constantly making choices, so that you don't have to go back through and try and insert choices into your scenes.
Yeah.
So, right.
And no one's saying you need like intense plots. Like you don't need 30 pages of a plot, right? You just need to know like what choice the character's making at each point in the story, and all the important moments, especially. The rest, you can jump between these points. Discovery, right, your way between the inciting incident and the midpoint, right? But you need to know like, okay, this is their choice here, and this is their choice here, and this is how it's going to affect. And if you don't do that, you're probably going to write something.
Yeah, I would have a check-in at every chapter, because every chapter needs rising action and a climactic moment, whether it's a subtle, quiet internal climax or a big explosive climax, doesn't matter, but every chapter rises to a peak before we have that chapter break. So each one of those chapter breaks is an opportunity to examine what your protagonist has just done. And is there a choice in there? Is there rising stakes? What's next? You know, were there extra characters cluttering up the scene? Getting in the way, taking away agency.
Right. I guess if you write a whole chapter and it's about a secondary character making a choice, you've probably not done it right.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So how do you feel about so you know the difference between like action and reaction scenes, and some people say that a story is like action and reaction chained together, right? So it's like action scene and then the reaction, how the character deals with it. So in action scenes, or the active scenes where something is happening to the plot, is happening to the character, they have to make a choice in the moment. It's kind of easier to me to have the protagonist make a choice in that moment, because usually it's like action, especially in the stories I write. And then usually, they're going to reflect on what happened and make a decision about how they want to move forward. So do you have any tips for like how to make sure that your protagonists are active in reaction scenes? So in scenes where they've just gone through this, maybe a battle scene or a big fight with their mom, or whatever they've just done, and then they're reflecting on it. How do you make sure in the reaction scene that the character is being an active protagonist?
By continuing to advance the story toward the climax. So in one example I give in my workshops, this teenage girl walks in on her parents having a big fight, and she says something smart-mouthed to her dad, and he slaps her. So that's that climactic moment at the end of the chapter. There's a chapter break. That's the action in your terms. So the reaction is, how does she respond to her dad slapping her? Like most teenagers, she hops in her car and flees the house. Well, a girl driving in a car at night thinking that she's mad to her parents is awful. It's bad fiction. You can't have someone mentally processing for that long. That won't sustain a chapter. It'll sustain a scene, not a chapter. So that is a scene that opens the next chapter, but that car has to take her somewhere. And when she gets out of the car, she meets a guy in his 20s with a motorcycle. Now we've got a new character, new stakes, new tension. How is she going to interact with this guy? Is he a threat to her? Is he safe? Is she going to run away from home? What kind of trouble can she get into? So don't try to turn your reactions into entire chapters. Make sure that they are a link in a chain that continues raising the stakes toward your climax, toward a new story element.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Thanks.
Especially like the scene is not the chapter, right? I think a lot of people make this mistake because of the way a lot of popular writers, like James Patterson's one scene chapters. He always does one scene chapters, and so writers will write a chapter that's actually just a scene. Right?
Yes. Did you see me roll my eyes?
What? You've encountered this before?
Oh, do you know how many like one scene per chapter manuscripts I see? And it's like, okay, all of these chapters, they aren't chapters. There's not enough dramatic tension, not enough stakes to carry a chapter. And the scenes are good scenes and they're necessary to the story, but they aren't a chapter.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe we should have a different discussion about the difference between scenes and chapters. It sounds like it's a whole can of worms.
We should, actually, yes. All right, folks, coming up soon. The structure of a story, scenes versus chapters. Good. Cool. Well, on that note, any final thoughts? All right. That's it for us tonight. Thanks a lot.